So we just finished up the transmission rebuild. Today we're diving into this Dana 18 transfer case, starting to get it rebuilt. So now that we have everything cleaned up, we're going to start this rebuild with the front output of the transfer case. We're going to go through, put in some new seals, new bearing, and we won't forget the snap rings this time. Alright, so we have the front output all rebuilt, new seals, bearings, we have the shift fork all in there and wired in. So we're going to go through and mount this to the transfer case, and we have a new gasket. Before we bolt this to the transfer case, we're going to go through and put a race in here for the bearings on the output shaft. Alright, so we have the front output on, and you saw me hitting it down with a block of wood and a mallet, and that was to fully seat the race that we put inside of the case. So now the next thing that we can go through and do is install the second shift rail and then the shift fork. Now before we install this, we need to make sure that we install this, what's called a bullet, that goes in between the two shift rails. So the ball and spring that we put on the outside rides in these grooves. And that's what keeps it in place when you shift it into the full wheel, high range, anything like that. What the bullet does is rides on the other side and makes sure that the shift rails aren't doing anything that they shouldn't be doing in relation to each other. So that if one's in a certain spot, the other one can't be somewhere else that could cause some damage inside the transfer case. So we'll get that installed. So that took quite a bit of doing to get that done, and I hope I captured it well with the camera. I guess we'll find out when I go to edit. It was pretty tricky to have both the gears, the thrust washer, the snap ring, and the bearing, having to keep it all on the shaft and then try and get that snap ring to seat. So the next step is to go and install the bearing and race on the rear output, and then we'll install the rear cover. And with that, we'll go through and shim it. And we're going to use the original shims, at least the shim pack, to get us in line. And then once we take the measurement on end play, we'll see how do we need to adjust these shims to get the right end play on this shaft and on these bearings. Alright, so we got the back cover on and we have an end play reading. Now it took me a few times going through pulling this off and adding more shims before we were able to get that reading. And what I was doing with putting the yoke on and the slide hammer is if that race was driven in too far, even if I had more shims and I just tried pulling on it, I might not have been able to pull that race back into where it sits. So by pulling the shaft back, we're pulling the bearing and the race back and seating the race into where it hits on this cover. So we're right about 5 to 6 thousandths now. We want to be somewhere between 2 and 6 thousandths. I'm going to go through and see if I can pull out a 3/1000th shim to get us closer to the middle or lower end of that. Novak recommends to put RTV between each shim, so even with that little bit of RTV, that might build up and we might end up with a little bit more end play. So I'll go through, pull one of those shims out, get everything all sealed up and put back on. Then we'll start going through installing the bearings and installing this intermediate gear. So now that we have the back cover all installed, all sealed up, we have about 4 thousandths of end play, which is right where we want to be, between that 2 and 6 thousandths. Next thing we're going to do is go through and install the intermediate gear. And so we got to go through, same thing with the transmission, we just have some loose needle bearings that we'll pack in here. We use the same synthetic transmission assembly loop to hold everything in place. And with the Novak rebuild kit, we have a new intermediate shaft that has O-ring grooves. And those O-rings are going to go, obviously seal in the bore here to try and help prevent any oil leaks. Alright, so we have the cluster gear installed, all the needle bearings stayed in as we drove that shaft through, so we're good there. So the last gear that we have to install is the input gear, and we can't do that with the transfer case alone. We need to mount this back up to the transmission, because then this will actually spline to the output shaft of the transmission and drive the rest of the gears in the transfer case. So we're going to hop from this bench over to another bench where we have the transmission already set up, and we'll get this bolted in, and then we'll be able to get the gear on. And then I'm going to attempt to do sort of a similar thing I did with the transmission to show the inner workings. It'll just be a little tricky now with the transmission on to be able to do that. But we'll see how it goes. Alright, so we have the transfer case now mounted to the transmission. We have the transmission in third gear, just so that it's a 1-to-1, so as we spin the clutch, the output of the transfer case, we can count and see the difference. So right now the transfer case is in 2 high, so as I move the clutch, we can see the line on the clutch, and we can see I have this yoke marked with a line there. So as I spin the clutch 1 revolution around, and I'll just hold the front yoke so that doesn't spin, we can see as the clutch moved 1 around, the output of the transfer case moved one rotation around as well. All right, so the Dana 18 is a twin stick design. So obviously there's these two shift rails, and each shift rail is operated by its own shifter that I don't have on yet. This inner shift rail operates just the front output. So even if I were to flip this over, we can't see it because that shift fork is all now self-contained inside of this front output. But what this shift rail does is simply lock the front output to the rear output. So when it's pulled out, the front and rear are now locked. If I push it back in, the front is now independent. Now this outer shift rail is what controls the high range and low range. So right now it's in neutral. So as I spin the clutch, nothing happens on the output. If I pull this shift rail out, we'll just get it so the gears line up. That is now high range. So again, if we watch the lines on the clutch and the line on the output, 1 revolution on the clutch, 1 revolution on the output. So I can operate high range with or without the front output being locked. So we can go back to neutral. And then if we try and go straight into low, it won't let us go in. And so that's because of that bullet that I mentioned in between the two shift rails. So in order to go into low range in this transmission, we need to lock the front output. Then that will allow the shift rail to go back in, and now we're in low range. So again, if we watch the clutch come around, so there's 1 rotation on the clutch, 2, maybe 2.5 rotations on the clutch for the 1 rotation on the yoke. So now let's flip the transfer case and transmission over and see what's happening inside the case as we move these shift rails in and out. All right, so now we're looking at the underside of the transfer case. So down at the bottom, we have the input gear, the intermediate gear, and then the output. So right now the transfer case is in neutral. So as I spin the clutch, we can see the input gear moving, intermediate gear moving, but nothing happening with either of the yokes for the output. Now if I shift this into high range, and this gear moves forward, it now engages this gear on the output. And so now I'll just hold the front output, but that is now high range 2-wheel drive. Same thing, I can lock the front output, and then it would be 4-wheel drive. And now locking the front output, again, that's inside of this case. We can't see that shift fork moving. And then if we go to low range, the gear slides back to there. And then that's where the gear reduction comes from, the difference between this smaller gear now driving the large gear on the output. All right, so that's pretty much the inner workings of a Dana 18 transfer case. Now, not all transfer cases are created the same. Obviously, this is a gear design. There are ones with chains. I have a Dana 300 in my CJ7, and that works a bit differently than this Dana 18. So my Dana 300, same thing, 2 shift rails, but each rail operates the front or the rear axle, front or rear outputs. So on this, you have 1 shift rail for high and low range, and 1 shift rail to either lock or unlock the front. On the Dana 300, I can get 1 shift rail to run the front axle, high or low, and then the second shift rail to run the rear output, high or low. So in the Dana 300, I can run the front output independently of the rear output. But with the Dana 18, obviously you can't do that because the rear output is always spinning, and it's only you choose if you engage or disengage the front output. All right, so that's pretty much everything we had in store for today. In the next video, we're going to get this mounted to the engine, get the engine, all of this mounted into the frame. So I left the nut loose on the input gear of the transfer case, and that's because I'm going to be mounting something here off the back of the transfer case in a future video. But thank you for taking the time and watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.